I would like to introduce Johnnemann Nordhagen from Dimbulb Games, developer of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which launched yesterday on Steam. Hopefully you're picking that up, and if not, you can learn more about the game by talking to Johnnemann. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so hold your questions if you have any. And we will start with the background, the beginning. So tell me about
Oh,
your
good.
background and how you started. I heard you started in QA, and don't skimp on the Bioshock and Gone Home parts.
Yeah, that's right. I started my career in the game industry as a QA tester for Sony, and the way that consoles work is when a game is done, they kind of submit it to the console makers for final approval. There's a process that all the big three have, and so I was in that department, and I got to see a lot of games that were finished or thought they were finished come in for their final approval from Sony, and it was a really interesting experience. I knew very little about the game industry before starting that job, and that is a really good place to start if you kind of want to see how the sausage is made. You get to see things that are almost done, but you get to see the last little bits go in, and it's really interesting because it teaches you how a game is not done until the very, very final minute, usually. And
Swoop in and save things with
after,
giant bug.
yeah, exactly. Yep. So after QA, I was lucky enough to be kind of hired into the research and development department at Sony. Because I was a software engineer, and so I moved from QA into there and started working with a lot of really cool technology. This was just as the PS2 was sort of not exactly fading away, but the PS3 was on the horizon, and it was going to be the next cool thing. And so we had these giant metal boxes, two power supplies. We called them Shreks because they were so huge. And those are the PS3, the very first PS3 units. And I got to work with those and learn how to program for them and do all this cool stuff with that. And because of my experience working with the PS3 so early on, when 2K Marin was looking for folks to help them port Bioshock to the PS3, I got hired to do that, and that was really great because that was my first time working on an actual game team, which is what I, of course, always wanted to do, but sometimes we take roundabout paths to get there. So I got to work on this amazing game, Bioshock, and then got to work on the sequel as well, and then I became more of a gameplay programmer for Bioshock 2. And I got to work a little bit as well at 2K Marin on a game called The Bureau XCOM Declassified. But I didn't finish that one out. Instead, I left 2K and moved up to Oregon with a few of my fellow coworkers there. And we founded the Fulbright Company and worked for about a year and a half making Gone Home. And so that was three of us founded the company, me, Steve, and Carla. I was the programmer. And then we got joined by Kate a little bit later. And we made that game, which, of course, was an experience all in itself. That was a wonderful time to be an indie game developer, of course. But after that, I decided to go do something different, and so here I am, just released Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, the first game from Dimbulb Games.
Yeah. So how many games have you officially launched in your career overall?
So it's kind of surprising, even when I think about this, because I've been in the game industry for over 15 years now. But in that time, I've launched the PS3 version of Bioshock, Bioshock 2, and some DLC for it, and then Gone Home, and now Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. So what is that? That's like 4 games or
Yeah, if
something
you
like
don't
that?
count the
So
DLC.
that's yeah. So that's in some ways that seems a little low for 15 years, but for a lot of that time I was doing back end sort of stuff. And games, they just take a long time to make.
Yeah.
Where the Water Tastes Like Wine has been in development for over 3 years now, so that happens.
Yeah. Well, how do the experiences differ, I guess, depending on the role you're in? Like, do you have, I mean, obviously this game is very close to your heart, but compared to, I guess, like, let's say BioShock is your first real official game, like, do you still have that same level of excitement, or how does it differ when it's your own?
It is definitely very different. Like, being a part of a team at a place like 2K is a really neat experience, and it's fantastic. But at the end of the day, you're kind of one person among many, and I felt a lot of pride for the games that I worked on and that we released there. But it wasn't my vision. It was me helping, me and a whole team of people helping to realize kind of a collective vision, or the creative director's vision, or whatever it turned out to be. And this game is very different in that this was my idea from the beginning, and I sort of contacted everybody else who worked on the game, and I got them to do their work and put in their contributions, and sort of had total responsibility for everything from the beginning, which is nice in some ways, but as you can imagine, is also incredibly terrifying, right? It's a lot to have on your shoulders.
Yeah. Well, now we can move on to Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, because we're already there. So, first of all, have you ever regretted the title length?
Oh gosh,
I love abbreviating this.
Yes, there's definitely, so it doesn't abbreviate particularly well, because if you do WTWTLW, that's actually longer than just saying Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, and it's hard. But yeah, there were definitely times early on when people would like come up to me at parties and say things like, "Oh, you're making that wine game, right? Like where the water turns to wine, or wine tastes like water," or like people would come up with all sorts of ridiculous permutations on the title. But because of the meaning of the title and what it says about the game and the themes and everything else, I still think it's the perfect title for the game. I wouldn't change it if I could.
Excellent. Well, for those in the stream, I realize that the cam is not necessarily the highest of quality. We have some latency and some other stuff, but the sound is good, and hopefully you can still see Johnnemann's smiling bearded face and enjoy that. So, sorry, not sorry. Let's break that down, because you were talking about the title. For those who haven't played the game, that really kind of ties in. Can you kind of give a summary of the game for people?
Yeah, of course. So, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a game about traveling and telling stories. And what you do is you wander across the U.S., kind of in the Great Depression era of the United States, and you have little adventures that give you stories. And you carry these stories with you. And when you meet characters, you can sit across the fire from them and sort of trade stories. You tell them a story about love, for example, or about sadness, and they'll tell you something from their life about love or about sadness. And when you tell someone a story, they'll tell it to someone else, and they'll tell it to someone else, and so on and so forth. And eventually you'll start to hear your own stories come back to you, except they'll be changed. They'll be bigger and weirder and more interesting, and they'll be better stories. And that's because that's what folktales do, right? People take them and they tell them and they add their own little bits to them, and from a tiny true thing, eventually you grow a really wild, interesting folktale.
Awesome. Starguarded is telling you the story has grown in the telling. Where the Water Turns into Water is the new modified story for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. It's come back to you.
Good, yeah, hey, that's a really good example. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. That's exactly what telling stories in the game is like.
Yes. Okay, so telling stories is something that's kind of unusual, and I understand that after Gone Home you took some time to kind of wander around everywhere, and I heard Siberia mentioned as well. Camels even? So do you have some traveling highlights that you'd like to share with people? This sounds like a wild adventure of your own.
Oh, it was absolutely a wild adventure, and this is what inspired the game, really. And yeah, there's so many highlights, but definitely like sleeping in a cave in Turkey, riding camels in the Sahara in Morocco, watching the sunrise at close to 10,000 feet in the Annapurna range. It was a really spectacular journey, and I'm so glad that I got to do it. And I hope that the game, even though it's set in a totally different time and a totally different place, captures some of that magic of having those experiences and seeing those things, meeting people and exchanging experiences with them.
Wow. Yeah. That's. I'm going to take a pause because I think you have to make another game now. That's not necessarily US based.
The one.
Yes, that one.
Yeah, the one about traveling around the world. Yeah. That would be a lot of fun. Although honestly, one of the interesting things about traveling around the world is you start to realize how much time you do spend traveling and the kind of space there is between places. One of the goals that I had in doing this trip was to not take planes whenever I could avoid it, because I feel like planes are they're almost like teleportation, right? You kind of you step into this thing, and a little while later you step out somewhere else, and you don't see what has passed in between. You're just all of a sudden somewhere new.
That's true. You don't get a feel of the distance you've traveled by any means.
Right, exactly. So I took a lot of trains, and I took a lot of boats and buses and things like that. And it's really fantastic because it really feels like you can tell that you've traveled a long way when you spend a week on a ship crossing the Atlantic, or a week on a train across Siberia, or any of these things. Like you get a sense for really how big places are. I don't know. I hope that the game captures some of that too, that sort of loneliness of the travel and the scale of it. It should feel like you're crossing distances.
It does, and I think that's one of the things about the actual mechanics of the game, of getting from place to place. Some people will say, oh, this takes a long time to walk. Well, it's a very big country, so it does, and that's something you kind of get from the game for sure, that there is a lot of traveling, and that takes time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So why choose the U.S. For the site of this game, and particularly the Depression era? And I'm going to guess it might have something to do with your love of trains and the fact that transportation was quite different back then.
Yeah, that's true. I do love trains, and transportation was different back then. I came up with the idea for this game on this train in Siberia, and I was trying to think of what I would want to make a game about, and traveling was, of course, top of the list right then. It was the first thing on my mind because I'd been doing so much of it. But another thing that I really love and have always loved is American roots music, bluegrass and blues and folk and things like that. And I wondered if there was a way I could, combine both of those. And I thought, well, of course, the kind of hobo era of hopping boxcars and riding the rails of the U.S., like that's travel in kind of its most essential form, like that's the most romantic vision of travel that we have in this country, is the freedom of slinging your bindle over your shoulder and hopping on a boxcar and going wherever the winds might take you, right? And of course, the romanticized version is very different from the truth, but I wanted to try and capture maybe both sides of that, capture the freedom that it might feel to be a hobo in the Great Depression era, but also capture the reality of the time, which was that it was a pretty rough time to be alive, and if you were a hobo, it was not by choice always, ever, but it was
ever, yeah,
because you were struggling, it was because there wasn't any work where you were, and you were trying to feed yourself or your family, and you were one of these dispossessed people wandering the U.S. There were something like 2 million homeless people displaced during the Great Depression, and it was a tough time to be around and be poor in the U.S.
I am trying to play some of the music in the background for those of you who see me kind of fussing a little bit, so you can hear that a little bit while he's talking. Hopefully, it's not overwhelming him. But yeah, we will get to the album, the Ryan Ike contribution here as we go on. All right, and that's what this brings us to, the small circle of creativity in this industry. So how did you meet Ryan, composer for everyone who doesn't know, and end up with such a talented group of basically artists and writers and a whole variety of people?
Yeah, it's amazing to me every time I look at the list of people who contributed to this game and helped me make it. It's just phenomenal, the amount of talent that's there. And Ryan specifically was interesting because he reached out to me. He found me. I can't remember how exactly, but we connected via the internet first, and he saw that I was coming to PAX, and he wanted to grab a drink while we were there, get some coffee and talk. And I saw that he had, been the composer on Gunpoint, which is a game I enjoyed. And so I said, oh, sure. And we talked, and he just is incredibly smart guy who knows a ton about music. And he was so excited about the ideas behind the game and the sort of inspiration that I'd drawn from this folk music, the American music that I wanted to capture. And he was just so excited about it and so passionate, and we hit it off big time right there. And I'm so glad that he was on the game. For everybody else, it was a variety of things. The first writer I talked to was Gita Jackson, who's amazing, and she wrote actually two of the characters in the game. She was fantastic. She really helped us figure out what the characters were like, what the stories, how to tell stories in the kind of strange way that we do with the dialogue, and giving you little bits and pieces here, so it's a mystery to kind of uncover their full story. And then from there on, I reached out to other writers I knew and tried to bring them in. I got a lot of really talented folks like Kara Ellison and Lee Alexander, Matt Burns, some really amazing people. And then as my direct network kind of dried up, I had those folks, reach out to their friends, and I reached out via Twitter, and I contacted, all of the writers. There's a total of I think 24 writers total in the game who contributed, which is huge. There's no game like that, especially not an indie game. And it's been really great. Every one of them is incredibly talented, and I'm so glad to have them contributing to the game.
Awesome. It's really fun to see the fan reactions at conventions with playtesting, especially when people kind of see the game for the first time. Do you have any moments that stick out to you? I know we were together at PAX, I guess Prime, for showing. Tell us, Johnnemann, tell us the story.
That is my absolute favorite part of that show, was that when we had too many people playing, we'd have a line, and that booth was just amazing. Good Shepherd did such a fantastic job creating and setting up that booth. For anyone who didn't get to see it, it was sort of this grassy field with a beautiful backdrop, but on the grass we had a sort of fake campfire set up with hay bales around it, and there were fruit crates full of real fruit that people could take and eat with stickers of the game on it. It was wonderful. But what we do is as people, there were too many people playing the game for, there were too many people there who wanted to play the game, and so we had a line. And what we do is we'd have those people sit down on the hay bales, and I'd sit down also, and I'd just talk about the game. They'd ask questions, or I'd just give the presentation, and it was just like sitting around a campfire, as you might have done camping as a kid or as an adult or anything, and just telling stories about things, except in this case it was the story of the game and what you do in it and everything like that. And it was just such a wonderful time. It was really great.
Do you find that when you're traveling, maybe it varies in different cultures, but people are really kind of isolated and insular when they're traveling and don't often kind of look at anyone else. And I would imagine that storytelling in our current era is probably a lot more difficult than it was back then, where you had no cell phone or nothing to entertain you except your passengers and nosiness.
Yeah, probably. I think that's true of the majority of people. One thing that I found when I was traveling was that there's actually a separate kind of sub-community of travelers, like people who are not just going from place to place, but who are doing like I was doing, wandering around the place, who enjoy that. And you could meet a lot of people who were really interesting, who were just happened to be on the boat with you or on the train with you or whatever sort of thing. And they were always really eager to meet travelers from different places and share stories. So that was a big part of the inspiration for the game. I met people like a couple who had worked in a yacht galley for passage across the Pacific Ocean. Like it was them and a few other people on this boat. It was some guy's yacht, and they were just there cooking and doing other like boat tasks to earn passage across the ocean, which seemed like such a thing that I didn't know existed still in this year, in our time. And I met a woman from Japan who had been on the road for 5 years. She didn't really live anywhere. She had just been traveling for that long. And lots of people actually who had been out there for months, years, a long time, just wandering from place to place. And it was really interesting. You'd meet someone and then go your separate ways, and then maybe later, sometime else on the trip, you'd run into them again because they happened to be going to the same place or whatever. And that sort of, lucky coincidence really inspired the meetings in the game where you get to meet these characters who are traveling around the U.S. also and share stories with them.
Gotcha. So have you ever jumped a train? You can be honest.
I haven't, I really
I
want to try it. Yeah, I do. It's of course illegal, but there's people who do it. And when I started the research for this game, I actually found even I think it was probably Vice, but there was some like video journalism thing of some reporters who had decided to hop a train and go to the Hobo Convention, which still happens every year somewhere in Ohio, I think, or Idaho, I don't know. And it was just really fascinating, and it's not impossible. People still do it. I've met people who ride the rails. It's not nearly as prevalent as it was, and it's probably not as fun. You don't get to hop in big empty boxcars and hang out with 5 of your fellow hobos or anything. You kind of have to lie on the little access area on the back of one of those big tanker or other freight carrying things and whatnot, and of course there's always the risk of death or getting arrested or other unpleasant things like that, but if it wasn't risky, it wouldn't be fun, right? So.
Okay, so moving on to Good Shepherd, how did you meet us, and what's the process of working with a publisher like? I'd imagine that you probably have done that before in these other 4 games.
So it actually, BioShock was published, the studio was owned by 2K and it was published by 2K, so that's kind of a different thing because it was an internal publishing arrangement. And also being like a gameplay programmer, it's not like I had a lot of interaction with the publishing side of things. And then Gone Home, we self-published. So this is my first experience with the full range of publishing things. But it's been really, really spectacular. I mean, I talked about the booth at PAX, and there's things like that. Obviously, Sting, our friend, the wolf, in the game. That absolutely would never, ever have happened without Good Shepherd being involved. I don't know Sting personally. I don't just have his number to give him a call and be like, hey, do you want to be in a video game? So that was was
How did you sit on that? I gotta say, before you go on, how did you just sit on that?
Gosh,
that was so hard not to say.
So hard. And I didn't believe it for the longest time either. Like, I just sort of,
We're just lying to you.
it was like, it was a possibility, and I was like, oh, yeah, right, that'll happen, and it actually, like, kind of seemed to start happening, and I was like, oh, yeah, that'll happen, and then it actually, it did happen, and I still kind of was like, is this real? Did I just, wow, it was something else, yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, so I was going to talk about first meeting Good Shepherd. Yeah, first getting introduced, and it was actually really interesting because we had been invited to show the game at South by Southwest, and Sydney was running the games portion of the show at that point. Sydney Metram, who works at Good Shepherd, and when she saw the game. And when some other people saw the game at the show, they reached out, and it was kind of perfect timing because we had just begun looking for a publisher. We'd sort of realized that the game would be a lot better if we had some more resources. Like, for example, we really, really wanted to do voice acting, and it was just not something that we could pull off on our own. And obviously, like, that was a great idea because the voice acting in the game is one of my favorite parts. I can't believe the phenomenal talent we got to do this and how well it turned out. Yeah, so that's where the conversation started, and then it went good places from there, and yeah, I'm super happy that we're working together.
Awesome. There's been a lot of speculation about the different characters, the 16 characters in the game, specifically Quinn. Can you tell people how they were inspired and maybe more about them, whatever you feel comfortable saying?
Sure, yeah, like, I don't want to spoil too much because, of course, the joy in the game is in discovering these characters' stories and who they are. But of course, one of the very first characters that I knew we had to have in the game from the very beginning was a hobo, right? I mean, you got to have one. And I began thinking about that and doing research for all the characters. Actually, I did a bunch of research. I did both historical things and I read like fictional stuff and everything like that. And for Quinn, I read the most influential book was one called Sister of the Road, which is supposed to be an autobiography of a female hobo during the Great Depression era, and it's full of really interesting stuff. And it turns out it isn't actually an autobiography. It was written by someone else, and it's a sort of fictionalized story, but it's really well researched, and it has a lot of fantastic details in it that inspired me. But another big one was a documentary, a PBS documentary actually, called Riding the Rails, and it's about these kids in the Great Depression. What would happen is families were everybody was poor and starving, and they were unable to feed all of their children. So they would take kind of the oldest children and decide, hey, you're probably old enough to fend for yourself.
Okay.
Why don't you go out there and make a life for yourself instead of being here and eating our stuff, and that seems amazing and callous and cruel to us now, and it was back then too, of course. These kids were like 12, 13, whatever, and being sent off to do this. At the time, there was less distance between that time and not so long before, when kids were farm hands or factory workers, or child labor was a thing, and so it was maybe slightly more understandable, but it's still an awful thing to do to a child, especially with everybody else out there on the roads seeking their fortune. It was undoubtedly an incredibly rough world to be pushed out into, and so that was why Quinn is a kid, is this idea that at that age you might just get shoved out by your family and thrown out there, and what would that look like? Like, who would you be, and how would you feel growing up as a hobo?
Yeah, well, clearly there would be respect. So,
Yes, absolutely.
lots of respect.
You can tell. Yeah, you can tell that Quinn's a little prickly, especially at the beginning there.
Yeah. Okay, so will you make more games as Dimbulb? Have to ask, obviously.
I would really love to. It always, of course, depends on how well things go. The game has been really well received so far, and I'm super, super happy about that. As always, we gotta succeed once before you can do it again. So we'll see how it goes.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're going to open things to Q&A in a second. So I know I'm getting on caffeine that maybe you're having some trouble hearing me. I will fix that in post, but there's nothing I can do now. The interview's pretty much over. So if you have any questions for Johnnemann and you'd like to get them out here now, we have a couple people, not too many in chat. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap it up. But while they're thinking of those questions, where can people find the game? And is vinyl going to make a comeback?
Oh yes, So the game you can purchase on Steam at just search for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. There's also a link from our site at wherethewatertasteslikewine.com. You can also find it though in a couple other places. It's on itch, and I believe it's on
Good Shepherd has it. Good Shepherd
Humble
Games
the other day too. But and Good
and
Shepherd.
GOG.
Go there too, and yes, it
will be
on
soon
GOG as well.
Yeah.
Will be soon. Yeah, it's not up right now, but hopefully very shortly. And then vinyl. So I have a record player, and I collect records, which is great because we yesterday announced pre-orders for the vinyl edition of the soundtrack for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Which is just spectacular. It is so gorgeous. It's 2 records because the soundtrack is enormous. And it's got a cover specially designed by Kellen Jett, who's the illustrator who kind of defined the style for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine and did a lot of our characters and things like that. So, of course, it's just a beautiful cover, beautiful package, all in all. And you can find that at lacedrecords.com, I believe.
Yes. Yeah, no, it is. I'm excited, but I have a Silvertone record player, so we're talking like 1910, 1920s. It will just scratch the heck out of that record, so I can't play it. I might have to buy a record player.
It's so appropriate for the period.
See, I wish.
Yeah,
I wish. Right. Okay, Star Guarded asks, what's your favorite kind of wine? Thanks.
Oh, wow. Gosh, I have to admit that I am not much of a wine aficionado. Like, I definitely drink it, but I do not know what I'm doing. I can't really tell the difference between one thing or another, and I buy the wine that has the label that calls out to me the most when I'm in the grocery store.
The art is what draws you to pick the wine.
But yeah, exactly. It's all judging the book by the cover right there. But yeah.
Interesting. I have often wanted, and I may someday, create a tasty where someone stands in front of a bowl of water, waves their hands, and there's wine, and that's the recipe for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. But no, apparently no wine. Does anyone else have a question that they would like to ask Johnnemann before we wrap up? Okay. I don't think so. Oh, wait. What's your favorite vignette of the 200?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, that's a hard question to answer. So the vignettes, for anyone who isn't familiar, those are these little adventures that you have as you wander around. You experience these things, and you get to make some choices, and you get a story out of it in the end. And so we call those vignettes. That's our name for them. And yeah, there's over 200 of them. So that's a lot to choose from. And then also, the people who wrote them are just some of the most talented writers that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. So there's a lot of really good stuff out there. There's one about a raven and a salmon that I really enjoy. That's spectacular. There's an incredibly touching one about some lighthouse keepers. Um, it's very early in the game, so I think people will know what I'm talking about if they've played the game. And then there's a few from like kind of the classic American tales that I really really like. One of my favorite American stories is the story of Taily-Po, and you can find Taily-Po in the game and see the seeds of that one, and it's incredibly creepy and really well done. Trying to think, there's probably there's another one that's called Unending Hunger, and I'm not even going to try and describe that one because it would spoil it, but it's really gruesome, very gross, and terrifying, and I really hope that people find and enjoy that.
Awesome. Okay, can we get any outtakes or blooper reels from the voice actors? I don't know, Ghoul Noise.
Oh gosh, that's an amazing question. I wish that, like we have, of course, all the raw recordings, but the disappointing answer is that these are all incredible professionals, and for most of them, it was just like, I never corrected anything. They just sort of went through the script and did a fantastic job on their very first takes. So unfortunately, they're just too good, and there aren't really a lot of bloopers that came out of it. There's a little bit of an ad-lib that Sting did, actually, in his recording, that I've kind of saved, and I don't know what, if anything, is going to happen to that one, but I treasure that one a lot, because that's an interesting thing to have.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, Johnnemann, and everyone else who's watching, and you will be able to see this up on YouTube on Good Shepherd Entertainment's YouTube channel, probably tomorrow if it's not extensive to edit. And yeah, make sure to pick up the game. It is on sale currently. I believe it's 15% off until March 7th, because this is launch week and we're super excited. So pick that up now if you're planning to pick it up at all, because this is a good time. So thank you guys, and we'll see you next Thursday on our usual 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time streaming channel.